All right, guys, what is going on? Welcome back to the expert interviews section of iCoach VIP members. So today, guys, we're bringing on Andreas. He is a registered dietitian in Miami, right? Miami, Florida?
Tampa, Florida. Tampa,
Florida. So I got connected with Andreas through Tony, who we also had on here as well. And so, yeah, man, I'll kind of let you take it away. Just kind of give us a little bit of background on you and kind of what you do currently and kind of what you do with business and all these types of things.
Absolutely, man. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of your VIP membership group. So definitely excited to bring in some value for your members and for your all your clients. So. But I wear many different hats, man. So I work as a full-time registered dietitian and director of sports nutrition for the Applied Science and Performance Institute, which is known as ASPI. It's a short version of it. And it's essentially a performance facility located here in Tampa, Florida, that specializes in, athletic training and performance and athletes, working with athletes at different levels. And at the same time, I also work and I have my own growing online coaching platform where I target males that are trying to improve their body composition and look and feel great. And that's kind of like mainly what my two roles are going to be. But I obviously have a lot of other things going at the same time as well. But yeah, my goal and my main objective is to provide value through nutrition education on infographics on Instagram. And I also have a podcast called Viva Nutrition Radio, where we share a lot of content and value and bring in expert guests, just like, we're doing today, to talk about specific topics within nutrition.
Yeah, man, I love it. I had no idea that, I thought you were 100% online. I didn't even know that you worked in person and had that role. So that was something I learned. That's really cool.
Yeah, well, my coaching, my business per se, my own business, it's all online. It used to be actually in person, so we had a little hybrid, but now it's the transition everything online. But ASPI, which is like obviously its own private company who I'm working for, that's an actual place where that's the part where I do work with a lot of my NFL athletes, like, Major League Baseball players, hockey players and stuff like that, from jiu-jitsu fighters to everything. So it's more of the application and more of the trenches as far as, working one-on-one with some of these elite level athletes per se.
Yeah, no, and that's what I meant. I actually had no idea that you did any of that. I knew that obviously, with Instagram and online coaching, I knew you did that, but it was cool to hear that you work with some high level athletes and you're able to have kind of that one-on-one athletes performance.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with them, but that's when I first got into the field. Athletes performance was definitely, who I was interested at that time. Like, I grew up like learning from like Mark Prestigian and going to their mentorships and seminars and all that. So
yep, big place.
That's awesome, man. Well, so guys, today what we're going to dive into is, a diet, if you will, intermittent fasting. It's something that, it's been around for quite some time now. And it's something that, I feel like it kind of pops up here and there, right? Like, I feel like there might be a time period where I hear about it a lot from clients and other coaches and on social media, and then maybe it dies out for a little bit and it comes back, almost like with any nutrition subject, right? But I want you to kind of break it down, because this is something like, how did you wrote an ebook on intermittent fasting. Like, how did you start getting so interested in intermittent fasting?
That's a good question. So the history of me trying to dive into this more in detail actually came when I was getting my master's at UCF, Central Florida in Orlando. So one of the things I had to do was complete a thesis, kind of like a special project. And I wanted to do a research. I was getting my master's in sports nutrition, and I wanted to do something different. And I started to read about fasting through, I think the first time I read about fasting was when I actually read an article by Hugh Jackman, how he was actually getting shredded for like his X-Men role or something like that. And he was talking about how he stopped eating for like 16 to 17 hours a day. And one friend actually brought that up to me, and he's like, yeah, man, like I'm starting to do like this fasting method and stuff like that. And us as dietitians and nutrition coaches, since we are in school, we are taught the opposite. It's like you're supposed to eat every so often. You're supposed to eat every 2 to 3 hours to keep your metabolism going and, quote unquote. So I was really interested in this, and I even told him, like, no, dude, don't do that. That's like terrible for you. So when I was getting my master's, I got really interested in understanding really what that was about, because I found out that there's a huge population in the world, Muslims, who practice this thing called Ramadan, which is essentially a religious month in which you fast from dawn to dusk. And I was curious from like the athletic standpoint, because I was working with sports nutrition and athletes, how does that affect an athlete from the perspective of performance whenever they're fasting? Because technically it's a religious thing. And in fact, there was a ton of research done on Olympic athletes, because sometimes Ramadan in some years can fall at the same time as the Olympics. Like it actually happened, I think, in 1968. So I was just curious to look at it, are these athletes at a disadvantage because they're actually fasting for so long? So that kind of sparked the interest in intermittent fasting. So I ended up writing a very long paper on the effects of intermittent fasting in athletic performance and whether or not it would affect it, which to my surprise, I ended up finding that it doesn't when there's certain factors that are actually considered. And that led me to write an article for the Journal of Strength, well, not the Journal of Strength and Conditioning, but more like they have like a magazine that is published usually monthly. So I talked a lot about that. And of course, I started implementing it on myself, and I saw amazing results as far as that too. So I started reading more of it and learning. I actually even did a 48-hour fast at some point, just to prove to the fact that I could sustain myself and that the body can adapt to it. So it's definitely been a process of research and experimentation that has led me to really be quite knowledgeable of all like the basics of fasting and fasting methods for not only performance, but also for body composition and for sometimes weight loss in this case.
I love that, man. So one question that pops up for me all of the time is, there's so many different, I guess, intermittent fasting like protocols, right? Depending upon who you look at, and I don't remember the exact, tailored names for them, but
yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about some of like the most common protocols that you use with your clients.
Yeah, so there's a few. And let's start off by saying that I don't consider intermittent fasting a diet per se, but more of a meal schedule. Sure. In which you are kind of limiting food intake for specific windows of time. And that window of time can vary anywhere between 12 hours up to 72 plus hours. So that's obviously depending on the protocol that you decide to do. The most common one, which had a common term called lean gains, based on the guy that kind of started writing and blogging about it, years ago. It's the typical 16-8 approach, in which you fast for 16 hours and you eat for a period of 8 hours or so. Most people implement it in a way in which that it's easier for them to do, which is they stop eating around 9 o'clock at nighttime, and then they start eating again at 1. So that's when the whole, bulletproof coffee sometimes started kind of happening, because they would start implementing in the morning when they were fasted or so. But that's essentially one way. There's another protocol called the 5-2, or the Eat, Stop, Eat. And actually the guy that wrote a book about this, his name is Brad Pillen or Pillen. I don't even know how to say his last name, but he essentially talked about eating normally for 5 days and fasting for 48 hours. So he would actually suggest to people, for example, to say eat from Tuesday through Saturday and then just fast Sunday and Monday completely. That's another method that was implemented. And there's a lot of research on a different one, which is called alternate day fasting, in which you eat normally for a day, and then the next day you reduce your calories to 25% of your total allowance, or basically your total caloric intake. So there's many different methods. I think, and the one I implement the most with my clients, is anywhere between 12 to 16 hours, because I think it's the most practical for a lot of people. And it's not as, let's just say, I'm not going to say brutal, because at first anytime that you're kind of like, getting your body out of its comfort zone is going to be different. But it's the one that is a lot of people can sustain for the longest. There's one more that I wanted to talk about, which is getting a lot of traction, because he made headlines recently on social media. It's called like the Oman diet, which is essentially, again, they call it a diet, but it's not necessarily a diet, in which you're only limiting your food intake to 2 to 4 hours a day. So that allows maybe like one massive meal. But there's a guy that really became famous on social media. I don't know if you ever saw him, that he made like, all kinds of like news outlets. Like he was actually showing himself like eating this massive pizzas with, like he made like tacos, and he would put like, Lucky Charms and stuff on top of it, completely, like making, something out of the picture. Like it was just ridiculous. And he was just basically saying how he lost all this weight by doing this. Obviously it's kind of sending the wrong message, of course, but that's another one that actually got pretty popular recently. But the one that I implement the most for myself and for my clients is definitely going to be that 16-8 type of approach, and this is the one that I wrote my ebook on.
Gotcha. So talk to us a little bit, like, just about, like, why would somebody even want to do intermittent fasting? Like, obviously, I'm sure there's a lot of people that come to you or me, like, as a coach, and maybe want to implement this strategy. But if you're a coach and you're assessing this individual, like, who would be, like, what would be the right application for somebody that wanted to implement intermittent fasting?
Yeah. Well, first, I think it's important to look at this as a tool in the toolbox. It's a strategy. It's not a do or die type of thing. And I think it's just essentially a strategy that anybody can implement effectively. I personally recommend it for those in fat loss stages, but honestly, a lot of times I implement it with anybody that is kind of interested to give it a try because of the benefits that they can provide. So let's talk about the benefits that they're still sort of like iffy on the research. But one of the things that actually happens as a result of fasting is improvements in insulin sensitivity, which is your body's ability to use glucose effectively. So your body's ability to use carbohydrates more effectively, to kind of use them for energy, not store them. So that's one thing that's been shown on research, both in animal and human studies, that it can improve that fact. So for a lot of people that are insulin resistant, people that have issues with glucose metabolism, or sometimes like obesity problems, intermittent fasting can be definitely an application per se. Actually, guys that are trying to gain muscle mass, believe it or not, and this goes against the grain as far as like what they've always been led to believe, that you have to eat every so often to gain muscle mass, because of the fact that when you implement intermittent fasting, what research shows is like human growth hormone levels can actually start to rise up after you do it for a prolonged time. Now, the 16-8 approach has not been shown in research to improve that to the same extent that very like prolonged fasting periods have. For example, when you fast for 48 hours, your human growth hormone levels actually skyrocket. That's a defensive mechanism of the body to essentially say like, whoa, dude, like I'm not getting any kind of nutrition right now, but I need to sustain my muscle. I need to sustain my strength, because I think the brain and our physiology still kind of, look at ourselves as like, kind of like in a survival mode. So we still need to be able to have the strength to go hunting, to go gather food, to do all these different things. So I think that's your body's mechanism to kind of preserve muscle mass and to even improve your body composition, so you can still essentially be able to provide for yourself and to get food in the absence or the scarcity of food availability per se. So that's another big thing as far as that. And usually people that that actually start doing intermittent fasting at first, they see an increase in metabolic rate. Why? Because there's an increase of adrenaline response, because it's a stress for the body. So because it's kind of something new for it. So there's some research showing that adrenaline responses in your adrenals are increased and more stimulated when you're fasting, because of that kind of like, they're kind of accelerating your metabolic rate. So technically when you fast, you start to burn more calories, believe it or not. So those are things that are perfect specifically for people that are trying to want to lose body fat. And from the practical perspective, which is the last one I wanted to talk about, it's just simply the fact that for a lot of us that have busy lifestyles, we have kids, we have businesses, we have things that are that gets us so caught up. Sometimes intermittent fasting is just a very practical way of living, because of the fact that you don't have to really think about breakfast. You don't have to think about preparing your food or anything like that. And some people implement fasting in a way where they have 2 massive meals. So lunch and dinner, maybe some snack in between, and still be able to meet their calorie needs on a daily basis. I am a person who likes to eat quite bigger meals. So I enjoy intermittent fasting because of that fact. I dislike heavily when you tell me that I'm supposed to eat this little portion of food and then kind of split it up like 5 or 7 times on a daily basis. I'm not a big fan of that. So I find this to be very practical for many people on that regard. And I feel like it just makes things a little bit easier for you. And the last one, I think, I said that the last one before, but the psychological benefits of it. Because when you fast and you learn that hunger, it's actually not something that it drives you. And like when you feel hungry, really, are you hungry or are you actually in a starvation mode? Because a lot of times when we feel hungry and we kind of have like that stomach pain or something like that, immediately we think like we need food, when sometimes hunger comes in waves. And if you actually learn to overcome that wave, you can still sustain yourself for long periods of time. And if you don't believe me, or people listening in do not believe me, ask yourself the last time, for example, that you slept all the way through 2 o'clock in the afternoon and didn't really have a need to eat, or times where you were so busy that you completely went for hours straight up until the point that you didn't really have to, you ate at like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So it's doable and it's sustainable. So it changes your perspective on how you see food and hunger and those kinds of things.
I love that. So one thing that I see a lot, and I've experienced with intermittent fasting as well, simply because, like you said, it's nice to be able to wake up, grab coffee, do the creative work, not worry about breakfast and all that, and then maybe start later in the day. Now, this is where I would ask the question would be for the individuals that are working out in the morning. So they're doing a 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. workout. Now, if they're doing an intermittent fasting protocol and let's say they're eating at 1 p.m., now, would you consider that to be bad if they're doing like high intensity exercise or any workout at all in the morning and then not having any type of post-workout meal?
So yeah, that's a good question. And I can tell you both anecdotal kind of like stories as far as like what happened to me and what I saw happening, because I used to do CrossFit at a pretty high intensity level at 6 a.m. in the morning, and I would not eat anything until 1. And I can also tell you what research has been showing, not on the perspective of training, because there's not a ton of research showing like, oh, if you wake up and you don't eat anything for, from 6 a.m. in the morning. I think there are a couple of things. But so what happens really is that, first off, when you have that kind of intense level of training, it really depends on what you had the night before. Because here's the thing, if you had a really good high carbohydrate meal the night before, your glycogen levels are not going to be depleted by the time that you wake up in the morning to go and train. So technically speaking, you should have enough carbohydrate availability to sustain yourself for like a 1 hour workout, especially for your Gen Pop and general population that are doing maybe 1 hour of training. It will probably be a different story for your CrossFit athletes and those ones that are more competitive. But for the average person who trains like an hour in a day, if you're having a really good, rich carbohydrate meal at nighttime, in the realm of a regular whole foods diet, I definitely think there's not really a need for it. And the second thing that would come along with this is the fact that if you are meeting, you're going to ask yourself if you're meeting your protein needs on a daily basis. Because what research shows is if you can meet your protein needs on a daily basis, there's no kind of risk of reducing or losing body muscle mass as a result of that, because you're fasting for a good 6 to 7 hours before you actually have your first meal. So in my hypothesis is also the fact that if you're starting to see increases in human growth hormone, I think the fact that you're training and you're putting that stress extra in the morning on a fasted state could increase even that ability to produce. As again, this is completely hypothetical, but I think it could actually be beneficial. And I can tell you from, anecdotally speaking of my experience, I can tell you that I saw an amazing result by doing that. And I would literally just have water in the morning, a little bit of coffee, sometimes MCT, and we can talk about some exceptions to the rule that can be applied. But then I would not eat an actual meal until 1 o'clock. Now, when 1 o'clock came around, I would eat a massive meal. I would eat a good amount of calories. and I actually got leaner, and I feel like I gained muscle mass as a result. So from the research perspective and from, my anecdote, my personal experience, I don't think it's necessarily bad if you are kind of like, checking all the boxes as far as, your enough carbohydrate intake the night before, proper hydration, proper protein intake, and at the same time, proper sleep.
I love that. Did you ever experience yourself, because I know this will happen to me, is that if I do go work out in the morning and then I don't have anything, when I start getting around, maybe 9, 10, 11, 12, like I will actually feel the need to I have to have something right now, because I feel like whether it's the blood sugar dropping or whatever it may be, if the workout was hard enough, like I really need to get a post-workout meal or I just feel like crap. And so maybe that's just me. Did you experience any of that at all? Or?
It could happen. I think there's a lot of things that need to be considered, because one, what I think happens to a lot of people when they do fasting, and that especially when you're doing a very intense workout, is the fact that you're getting very dehydrated, and then sometimes you're not replenishing electrolytes. So a lot of people really focus a lot on water intake, and they stop to really think about sodium because they're scared of sodium, for example. They start to think about potassium, magnesium. Those are minerals that usually are lost through sweat. And whenever there's imbalances of them, we start to see obviously things like headaches. Obviously you start kind of like feeling a little dizzy and things like that. So whenever anybody's experiencing those kinds of things, when you hit like that 10, 11, 12 o'clock, what I would recommend is try to incorporate something like a Propel or something with like electrolytes added into them, and proper hydration, and see if that actually fixes the problem. If it doesn't, sometimes there's individual cases where individuals may suffer from hypoglycemia, and that's obviously a different story. So when that's actually happening, and you do feel like dizzy, like you feel like you're going to pass out, then at that point, that's something that, maybe may not be suited for an intermittent fasting type of program. And then that's a person that I would not recommend that for. And it also depends on how far into it you are, and as far as, your fasting. If you've been doing it for long enough, you realize that, you can definitely manipulate certain things depending, again, on what you're having the night before, and then again, replenishing your hydration status, fluid balance, and electrolyte balance as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I completely agree in terms of, a lot of people will ask, they're like, what do I do for the situation of somebody that's working out early morning? And so, I always talk about that dinner the night before, that's your pre-workout meal. We talk about like glycogen resynthesis on a 24 to 36 hour window. It's like 24 to 36 hours before you work out, like that's your fuel for the workout. Right.
And there's another thing important to consider too. Like there are no rules on the timing of your fasting too, because that's another part that a lot of people don't even consider. They think that this is this rule that you have to stop eating at 9 and you have to start eating at 1. No, if you wanted to do a different kind of fasting and stop eating at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and start eating it again at 7 o'clock in the morning, right after your workout in the morning, by all means. So you can still do that. The problem and the reason why most people don't do that is because when they create that kind of schedule, the social part of life sometimes gets a little in the way. So when Friday comes and you're like, oh, I'm fasting, and you go out with your friends, you want to have a drink or you want to have something, that's when things get a little on the way, because you still kind of want to keep it consistent. So for some other clients that I've worked with in the past, sometimes what we do is like, Sunday through Thursday, we do a 4 o'clock to 7 in the morning, and then Thursday hits, and then they do kind of like a prolonger kind of like fast. So now we're actually doing about an 18-hour fast, from, let's say, for example, from Thursday through Friday. And then on Friday, switch over to like a 9 o'clock to 1, and they do it for a couple of days. Still kind of maintaining that balance accordingly. So they can still enjoy their nighttime feeding, their nighttime drinking, and things like that. And not necessarily compromise like the goal that they're trying to achieve, which is maintain at least a 12-hour fast on a daily basis.
Got it. Yeah, and I love that. I mean, I think that's the beauty of, what you and I talk about a lot, which is, individualization, and that, here's some 16-hour protocol, but you can fit that into your lifestyle however it works best for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. So one more thing, just in terms of not having a post-workout meal after, this is an argument that I've heard, before, which is that, especially in the CrossFit space, if you're doing high intensity exercise and you have, that cortisol hormone, that stress hormone that's spiking up, well, if you don't have carbohydrates after that workout, then the cortisol levels are just staying elevated throughout the day, and you're not able to basically turn that cortisol valve off. Now, have you heard anything like that before? What are your thoughts on that?
The truth, honesty, is we're not sure exactly what happens, because the thing with cortisol, it's a hormone that wakes you up in the morning. So it's essentially the hormone that normally rises in the morning. If you actually have any kind of blood work done, depending on the time of the day, in fact, on the results that you get, they will tell you exactly what time of the day you did it, and they show you a curve of what normal level should be in the morning versus a normal level that should be in the afternoon. Now, cortisol is definitely a stress hormone, so it gets released and it's increased and higher in moments where in the morning time to kind of wake you up, and it usually starts to come down for the rest of the day, coming down to the lowest levels at nighttime, which is the time where your body's kind of like shutting down and getting ready to go to bed. So I think if there's any time, in fact, I just did a podcast with a nurse practitioner who's an expert in hormone optimization, and she talked a lot about the fact that sometimes training in the morning is more effective than training in the afternoon, because technically speaking, if you are increasing hormones like cortisol levels in the morning, I don't think they're going to remain too elevated, even if your intensity of training was too high, because they're still elevated in the morning regardless. Now, what I think is not ideal, and I do it because it's just how my schedule works, is actually training high intensity to very, very high levels at nighttime, because now you're actually keeping your cortisol levels elevated at a time where they're supposed to be coming down to help you recover and to help you go back to sleep and to kind of like keep you at a good level. So sometimes late night training is as probably as detrimental as actually training on a very fasted state in the morning time. Now, I honestly don't think, again, this is just me hypothetically speaking, that just like a 4-hour fast without carbohydrates are going to really affect your cortisol levels, like, to a degree that could be detrimental per se. But that's something that is worth testing. And I'm actually curious to kind of look at some data and see what happens if, you train at a very high intensity level for 1 hour and, you don't have any carbohydrates or any kind of food for 6 hours. And I would like to see kind of like the curve of the cortisol, if it remains more elevated compared to if you would have a normal meal. But that's an interesting question.
Well, and I think it's more like, so for the viewers watching, the normal cortisol curve, guys, it starts off high and it ends low, right? And so you see that curve shape like this. Now, with individuals that have issues, you'll hear it all the time, especially doing high intensity exercise at night. It's the tired and wired. They just can't shut their brain off, and they have issues falling asleep or even waking up throughout the night. So a lot of those individuals, you'll see that cortisol curve to be the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Instead of being high cortisol in the morning, it'll actually be low and it'll be high at night. Or these cortisol spikes throughout the night, which are waking people up. So I think the reference here was more so in that when you exercise, because you go into this like fight or flight mode, so therefore that cortisol hormone, that stress hormone, increases during that workout or after that workout. And so just using insulin, using carbohydrates to shut off that cortisol valve is kind of like what he was hinting at. So just one thing I was interested in.
It could be, yeah. It's something worth exploring. I think we, like I said, it depends honestly for on the training intensity volume, but I think it could be a possibility that it may be kind of like important to maybe include a feeding of carbohydrate at some point right after a workout. But some things that I feel like are not super researched, and I would just kind of need to look more in depth into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So I obviously, I saw the picture that you worked, I think you were working with Tony at the time, and, I saw the before and after picture. Now, I'm curious, did you use an intermittent fasting approach during?
Yeah, because what Tony had me do, and he's, I obviously had goals that were very aesthetic. So more like kind of like towards a bodybuilding, like prepping for a bodybuilding show, but not necessarily really prepping for anything, just kind of for myself. So I was very strict in many things that I did. And I included intermittent fasting because psychologically speaking, when I was in a very low caloric deficit, we kind of reach a peak where I was actually not very low, but obviously a lot lower than what I'm normally used to consume. I applied intermittent fasting. I would try to fast as much as I can so I could have meals that were satisfying to me. So when I actually put clients, just like I did myself, on very and caloric deficits when they're trying to lose fat, and let's say, for example, we did a reverse dieting process and we're bringing that person back down and we're reaching a peak in which like that's kind of like the lowest that they're probably going to go. Sometimes that week I will tell them like, let's try to do some intermittent fasting so it doesn't feel like you're so hungry all the time. Because I remember when I was peaking in that specific week where I was consuming very low carbohydrates, I mean, we're talking about closer to like 120 or so. So they were kind of low for that week. I was actually, and that was not doing CrossFit at the time. It was just more kind of like bodybuilding. But I wanted to have like a bigger intake of carbohydrates, in 2 massive meals. So at least that would allow me to kind of have 70 grams or so in 2 giant meals at that time, specifically on a day that I was kind of working out. So I tried to implement that, and it actually worked well because I didn't really feel as restricted versus if you were having a breakfast and a lunch and a dinner, and then there's like this much of carbohydrates that you can include. It was so unsatisfying, and I wanted to just, punch people in the face. So I was not very happy. So intermittent fasting was a really great method for me that worked well. And I honestly did that I did the intermittent fasting throughout the entire time, but just that peak week was like the one that I feel like, it definitely helped a lot to overcome a lot of those struggles being on a very, high caloric deficit. Now, when I still implement it right now, I honestly eat, I go through stages. So right now I'm on the protein pancake stage, and I usually have a massive protein pancake around 12 o'clock. And that's kind of like my breakfast per se. And then I eat again around 4 o'clock. And then I eat again usually around 8 to 9. And that's usually my last meal. And it works well for me because a lot of times, like, I have a sweet tooth, so it allows me to kind of manipulate my carbohydrates around my workouts a little bit better and have a little bit more fun as far as the kind of things that I can include. So it definitely helps many people too, as well, from that perspective, I feel like.
I love that, man. I love that. I think that's a great point, especially for, I think especially for males and being able to enjoy bigger portion sizes. I think more times than not, the males are the ones that want to have, much bigger portion sizes and feel much more full. And I think more commonly you see with women, like they're doing kind of the grazing effect and, eating 5 or 6 meals throughout the day or whatever. Obviously not everybody, but I feel like that's kind of definitely something of a norm that we see. So what are you kind of, as we start wrapping all of this up, I want to kind of just take, the biggest common mistakes and then kind of like just the big takeaways from everything. So like, what would you say are like the top 3 most common mistakes that you see with somebody either starting intermittent fasting on their own, or maybe just some misconceptions that they had about it?
Yeah. Number one, I think the biggest one I see, and no offense to women, but I see it most often in women, is the fact that they are usually women that they start doing this, they're coming off, and honestly, it happens to men too, to both. But I tend to see that they're coming with the idea of obviously fat loss. So the typical, when somebody's trying to lose weight, what the first thing they do is what? They reduce their calories and they increase their exercise. That's the typical go-to thing that they do. They don't really consider fueling per se, but more like, I'm just going to starve myself and I'm going to work out to death. So in intermittent fasting is kind of like a similar approach. They just go and they're going to cut out an entire 8-hour period or 6-hour period where they're not consuming food, and everything else stays the same. So they're starting off at a very, very, very high caloric deficit. We're talking about people consuming like less than 1,000 calories on a daily basis because they cut out like that 400 extra calories they were having for breakfast. And now they're entering in that kind of state in which you kind of reach that resistance. You may see results for maybe a week or so, and then your kind of body starts to get stressed out because of that very low caloric intake. So I tend to see a big mistake in women. And when I notice this is because when they keep doing this for a long term, we start to see issues with their menstrual cycle, because of the fact that not only you're being on caloric restriction, but at the same time, I think the body of a woman, since it's meant for reproduction, I think hormonally speaking, they start to alter some things that happen, and they make you not sometimes have periods or have missed periods because of the fact that, one, you're fasting, and two, you're having that massive caloric restriction. So those are two things that I feel like happen a lot of times, particularly in women. The second thing that I usually see a lot is the fact that people see this thing as a strict rule that you cannot eat at 12:59. You have to eat at 1 o'clock or after, or you're going to not see the changes in the results. Like, it's this little thing that is written in a book. It's not, it's, you want to fast 12 hours today because you had a breakfast and with your friends and a brunch, dude, just do it. It's not a big deal. So the whole idea behind this is just kind of creating a kind of like larger environment for your body to, number one, tap into fat stores a little bit better, and number two, to just simply kind of make things easier a little bit for you as well. But it's not necessarily this rule that you have to follow strictly. That's the second mistake that I see very often. And number three, I think along with number one, is also not meeting your protein intake, especially guys that are trying to gain muscle mass. And they started this process really thinking like, oh, I'm going to do fasting. And since technically your hormone, your hunger levels actually are affected, because I think there's some changes in leptin levels as well. Sometimes you're not as hungry as you used to be before. And sometimes that may affect the amount of protein that you may be consuming on a daily basis. So I think that's also something that a lot of people don't necessarily understand. And lastly, and last but not least, is just the lack of awareness. And I think this is something you and I have talked about, and Tony talks a lot about it, is the fact that they just don't know what they're doing, at the times that they're consuming food. So sometimes they're just kind of like the same thing with, sometimes like, the fitting the macros and all that kind of stuff. They just kind of gorge on food, and not necessarily kind of giving a structure on having a specific plan in place. And that's just not ideal either, because sometimes people don't see it as that, like, look, like I don't see it as a diet, but sometimes people kind of take that to the extreme and say, oh, it's all good, I'm just going to eat like crap. And because I'm doing intermittent fasting, kind of like the same mentality of like, oh, I'm working out, so no worries, I'm going to burn it all off tomorrow. So just going to eat all I want to eat tonight. I think those are like the biggest mistakes that I tend to see in a lot of people when they do fasting. And hydration is a big one, not staying well hydrated in the morning time as well.
Love that. Yeah, no, I completely agree. So wrapping this all up, I think this was a great overview of intermittent fasting, and just getting people to understand that even though, the media and everybody else maybe might look at intermittent fasting as a diet, it's more about the timing of when you're eating food. And I loved a lot of the great points that you brought up just around, not necessarily of intermittent fasting, but just big overall takeaways in terms of nutrition in general. So if you were to say, let's take intermittent fasting and keto and paleo and all these different diets, and we were to say, you know what, like the 5 like lifestyle or the 5 like biggest habits that I think will move people forward. So we can pull from nutrition, lifestyle, exercise. Like, what would you argue to be like, if you were to just make a blanket statement out to anybody, we could pull into like sleep as a category, but what would those 5 kind of areas of focus need to be that people need to work on doing consistently, kind of those big takeaways, and not get caught up maybe in all the little stuff all the time?
Absolutely. One, I think, is definitely, and again, I'm going to quote my friend Tony again, because I learned a ton from him, because the fact that I've done this long enough to know what hasn't worked for me as a coach and as a dietitian in the past, and what now works for me, which number one is creating awareness. A lot of people, especially, we live in a world that, fitness and nutrition are big, and that's exciting. But at the same time, there's so much misinformation that many people are just not aware whether they're doing the right thing or not. So creating awareness through, understanding what you're consuming, really diving deep into that, I think it's one thing that people need to start understanding where they're coming from. Number 2 is being freaking patient. That's another part, because I see it every single day, in which people go from like, it's like kind of like they're going from like, I don't even know a good analogy for it, but they're jumping from side to side of different diet, like they're doing it for 2 weeks and I'm like, okay, no results. I'm going to go to the next one. No results. Okay, this one I'm going to saw a little bit of results. Okay, I'm going to stick to one for 4 weeks. Okay, I stalled. Next one. So they're going through all this.
Right?
Yeah. They're just, and I think that's just the biggest mistake. And a lot of people look at me, for example, and when they look at that picture, it's like, oh, how long did it take you to see those results? And I say, it took me 2 months to go from there to there. Oh, wow, but I want those kind of results. And I'm like, well, first off, you got to understand what the initial picture actually started off from. And I've been training and I've been eating the, kind of like properly. Obviously, I was just a little off track at that point for almost like 6 years, consistently training, being, taking care of a lot of different things with ups and downs. But it's been 6 years doing this. And, like I didn't gain muscle mass just from like, overnight. And I think that's what a lot of people sometimes like miss, the fact that you have to be patient. You can't have things that fast. And that's why the kind of struggles, and I'm sure you deal with this on a daily basis, into the fact that you would get clients a week or two into it and they're like, I'm not seeing results, and you can feel it on their check-ins. And sometimes when they write stuff on their paper, like I got a client that literally told me like, like, oh my God, it's crazy how you can understand my feelings by just reading what I write on paper. And I'm like, yes, because I can definitely tell. So patience is definitely something that is important. Now, more into the details of nutrition, I think also I see a lot of times either people over consuming protein or under consuming protein. I think it's usually either like, extreme side of the spectrum. Usually guys are consuming way too much and women sometimes are under consuming. So that's, I think, something that needs to be fixed. I think there needs to be kind of like a balance on this. The other part is also, we live in such a stressed out world that we don't stop to breathe and smell the flowers. I think that's kind of like the way I kind of see it. We're so caught up in everything on life that our stress levels are to the roof. And just the simple fact that stress controls so many different physiological issues or physiological aspects on our body. Sometimes just controlling your stress and keep eating the same way that you've been eating, which is, it may be good, can be the only solution, the simplest solution to the problem. So sometimes obviously practicing meditation, being present, like trying to time block. I know you do that a lot, or, just being more effective with your time. And that's something I have personally struggled with, and I'm still kind of learning it. But I think that's definitely one big thing that a lot of people sometimes miss. What is that, number 3 right now? 4? I forgot. I got one more. The last one, I think, sleep. I think sleep is a big thing also too, that a lot of people don't prioritize, and I'm going to include myself in there. My fiance gives me crap about this all the time, to the fact that, you and I as entrepreneurs, sometimes we don't prioritize sleep as much as we should. I'm very big on waking up early, so I wake up every morning at 4, but it's not like I go to bed that late, but I still don't prioritize sleep as much as I should. And sleep is when everything happens in the body, when everything gets, renewed and resetted. And when we don't get enough, sometimes just doing that is just affecting everything else that happens in life. And lastly, I guess to kind of close up, people need to understand that nutrition is not what you put in your mouth. It's a combination of factors. It's a multidisciplinary approach. Just like sleep is important, also what you eat is important, how you recover from training is important, how much you exercise, how much you don't exercise. There's so many different things that come into play. It's kind of like a piece of a puzzle. And some people just get this idea that it's just all about what you eat and what you don't eat. And they stop paying attention to those important things. And you and I as nutrition coaches, we are nutrition coaches, but we are just coaches in general, because we're trying to teach people how to live better. Not just how to eat better, how to live better, because we understand that everything else that goes around nutrition also matters as well.
Yeah, I love that. There couldn't have been a better way to finish that off. I love it.
Appreciate that, dude.
Andres, my man, so many knowledge bombs tonight. I think this is going to add a lot of value to people's lives that are interested in just learning more about nutrition or specifically learning more about intermittent fasting. So first off, obviously you have an ebook on this. So if anybody wants to reach out and go see that, definitely check it out. But where can people find you? Your website, social media, where can people find you?
3 places, and I'm going to start talking about my podcast because it's brand new, and you were actually episode number 2 in it. But we have Viva Nutrition Radio. It's my podcast. It's on iTunes, and coming soon, it's going to be on Google Play and Spotify as well, on iHeartRadio and SoundCloud. Instagram is the best way to communicate directly with me, at Vive or VIVE Nutrition on, like I said, on Instagram. And my website is www.vive-nutrition.com. Those are the 3 places. The ebook you can download from my website. You can chat with me on Instagram, and you can listen to me on my podcast, Viva Nutrition Radio.
I love that, my man. Let me close us out here, and then I'm going to stop recording here.